The night was cold on the edge of the forgotten frontier world. Dark clouds covered the sky, and the only light came from the flicker of a broken street lamp near the forest road. A man named Daniel was walking back from the small town, carrying supplies in a worn bag. He was an ordinary human, a wanderer who had seen too many battles and too many lonely years. But tonight, something different waited for him, something that would change his life forever. As Daniel stepped onto the quiet path, he heard a faint sound. At first he thought it was the wind moving through the trees, but then he stopped, listening more carefully. It was not the wind. It was softer, weaker, almost like a cry, a child's cry. His heart tightened, because children never came to this part of the forest. The settlement was too far away, and no one would leave their young outside at this hour. He followed the sound, pushing aside branches, the darkness making every step uncertain. The cries grew clearer, trembling, full of fear. Finally, he reached a small clearing where the moonlight broke through the clouds. There, among the fallen leaves and broken metal, he saw her, a small figure, curled up beside the wreckage of what looked like a crashed pod. Her skin was pale silver, glowing faintly under the moon, and her eyes were large and shimmering with tears. Daniel froze. This was no human child. This was an alien, lost and alone. The girl looked up at him, her lips trembling. She did not speak his language, but the fear in her eyes spoke more than words. Her tiny hands clutched a piece of cloth, torn and burned, as if she had been running for her life. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to turn away. Aliens meant danger. If the wrong people found her, there would be trouble, but something inside him refused to leave her behind. She was only a child and she was crying. He knelt down slowly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Easy, little one," he whispered, though he knew she could not understand. The girl flinched at his voice, but her eyes followed his every move. Daniel noticed the bruises on her arms, the dirt on her face, and the way her body shook from cold. Whatever had happened to her, she had been through more than any child should endure. He pulled off his coat and carefully wrapped it around her small body. She hesitated, but when the warmth touched her skin, she leaned into it, shivering less. Daniel lifted her gently, surprised at how light she was. She rested her head against his chest, her breathing weak but steady. As he carried her away from the wreck, he could not stop looking back at the strange pod. Its metal was scorched. Symbols carved into its side glowed faintly. Whoever she was, she had come from far beyond this world, and someone might already be searching for her. The road back to his cabin felt longer than ever. Every sound in the forest made Daniel's senses sharp. Was someone following him? Had they seen the crash too? But the night stayed silent, only the whisper of trees and the faint breaths of the child in his arms. At last he reached his small wooden cabin at the edge of the valley. He pushed the door open and laid the girl on the old bed. She looked around with wide eyes, as if every corner of the room was strange to her. Daniel lit a lamp, filling the room with soft light. He brought water and bread, placing them beside her. The child hesitated, then drank greedily, her small hands shaking as she held the cup. When she finished, she gave him a look that was neither fear nor trust, but something in between. Daniel sat back, rubbing his tired face. What had he just done? He had brought an alien child into his home, a stranger who could bring danger to his doorstep. And yet, as he watched her curl into the blanket, her breathing calm and steady, he knew he could not have walked away. Something about her felt different, important. It was as if fate itself had placed her in his path. That night, Daniel could not sleep. He sat near the fire, watching the girl rest, listening to the sound of the night outside. Questions filled his mind. Where had she come from? Who had hurt her? And why did he feel that protecting her was more than just kindness, more than just duty? It was destiny. Outside, in the distance, a shadow moved among the trees. A pair of glowing eyes watched the cabin silently. The child was not as lost as Daniel thought. Her presence on this world had already drawn attention, and soon, hunters would come looking, asterisk asterisk. Morning light entered the small wooden cabin. Spreading across the rough floorboards, Daniel sat in his chair, half asleep, his eyes heavy from staying awake all night. The child was still there, wrapped in his coat, resting peacefully for the count. First time since he had found her, her silver skin glowed faintly in the sunlight, and her strange eyes opened slowly, studying the world around her. She looked at the fire, at the cracked walls, at the old tools hanging by the door. Everything seemed new to her. When Daniel noticed her awake, he smiled softly, trying to look less frightening. "Good morning, little one," he said. Though he knew she would not understand, the girl tilted her head, watching his lips move. Trying to catch the meaning, her small hands held the blanket tightly, her eyes full of caution. Daniel sighed, wondering how he could ever make her feel safe. He had lived alone for so long that even speaking out loud felt strange. He placed a bowl of warm soup on the table and gestured for her to come closer. At first she hesitated, her eyes darting around as if searching for traps. Then, step by step, she moved toward the chair, her bare feet making no sound on the floor. She sat carefully, her posture straight and alert, like someone trained to expect danger at every moment. Daniel noticed this and felt a small chill. No ordinary child carried themselves like that. She tasted the soup, her face softening at the warmth and flavor. For a moment, she almost smiled, and Daniel felt relief. It was a small victory, but it was enough to give him hope that trust could grow between them. "See, not so bad," he muttered with a small laugh. The girl glanced at him, puzzled, but something in her expression showed she was trying to understand. For the next few days, life in the cabin changed. Daniel found himself cooking more than usual, cleaning the space he had once let gather dust. The girl followed him quietly, watching his every move, learning without words. Sometimes she helped by handing him tools or placing wood on the fire. Other times she simply sat near the window, staring at the forest as if waiting for something or someone. Her silence was heavy, but her presence filled the lonely cabin with new energy. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Daniel tried again to communicate. He drew simple shapes on a piece of wood: circle, square, triangle, pointing and naming them. "Circle," he said. "Square." The girl's bright eyes followed closely, and after a moment, she pointed to the circle and whispered something in her own language. The sound was soft and musical, unlike any human tongue. Daniel repeated it clumsily, and to his surprise, she gave a small laugh. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Slowly, a bond began to form. Though they spoke different languages, small gestures, drawings, and patience helped them build fragile bridges of trust. Daniel gave her a name, Lyra, because he needed something to call her, and the name felt right. At first she did not respond, but over time she began to look at him whenever he said it. "Lyra," he would say, handing her food or pointing to something outside. Her eyes softened each time, as if the sound of the name comforted her. But not everything was peaceful. Strange things began to happen around the cabin. Sometimes the lights flickered even though they ran on steady power. Sometimes Daniel's old tools moved on their own, sliding slightly across the table when the girl grew upset. And once, when she had a nightmare and cried out, the fire in the hearth suddenly blazed twice as high. Daniel stared at these events with growing unease. This was no ordinary alien child. Something inside her was powerful, hidden and dangerous if discovered. One night, after she had fallen asleep, Daniel sat by the fire with his mind racing. Who was she really? What kind of people could create a child with such strange energy? And more importantly, would they come looking for her? He looked at her small form curled in the blanket, and his heart tightened. He had taken responsibility for her, whether he wanted it or not. Turning her away was no longer an option. The next morning, as the sun rose, Daniel decided to take her into town. He needed supplies, but he also wanted to see if she could blend in. He wrapped her in a cloak to hide her silver skin and told her to stay close. Lyra clung to his hand, her steps light and careful, her eyes darting everywhere as they entered the busy settlement. People glanced at them but did not question much. Daniel was known as a recluse, and many already thought he was strange. But Lyra's eyes widened at the sight of the market stalls, the smells of food, the chatter of merchants. For the first time she seemed curious rather than afraid. She touched colorful cloth, pointed at bright fruits, and even gave a small nod when Daniel bought her a sweet cake. It was almost normal, almost peaceful, yet Daniel noticed something unsettling. Two men in dark coats stood near the far corner of the market, watching too closely. Their eyes lingered on Lyra, and their faces were too serious to be casual. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Had they recognized her? Were they the hunters she had feared? He quickly pulled her closer, guiding her away from the crowd. Lyra sensed his tension and gripped his arm tightly, her wide eyes full of fear. Daniel's heart pounded as he led her back toward the safety of the forest. He knew then that keeping her hidden would not be easy. Strangers were already watching, and danger was moving closer. The peaceful days in the cabin were only the beginning. The real struggle was about to begin, and Daniel's choice to protect her would soon test everything. He had ***. The days after the market trip were heavy with silence. Daniel kept replaying the moment in his mind, the men in dark coats, their sharp eyes watching Lyra with unnatural focus. He knew that kind of look. It was the gaze of hunters, not merchants. Not travelers, but men on a mission. Since then, he avoided the settlement, keeping Lyra hidden inside the cabin or walking with her only in the deep forest. Far from curious eyes, yet even in the forest, he felt the weight of being watched. The trees whispered with tension, as if danger crept between their shadows. Lyra sensed it too. Though she had begun to trust Daniel, her eyes often darted to the window at night, her small body tightening at every sound. Sometimes she whispered words in her alien tongue, her voice trembling. And though Daniel did not understand, the fear in her tone was clear. It was as if ghosts from her past were drawing closer, ready to break into the fragile safety they had built. One evening, while gathering water near the river, Daniel noticed footprints in the mud, not his, not Lyra's, but heavy boots, 3 pairs at least, fresh and heading in the direction of his cabin. His chest went cold. He followed them only far enough to be sure, then rushed back. When he entered the cabin, Lyra was sitting near the fire, humming softly to herself, her small hands glowing faintly as they shaped a flame into strange patterns. He froze, staring. She quickly hid her hands, her wide eyes full of guilt. But the truth was already clear. Her power was real, uncontrollable, and if others had seen it, they would never stop hunting her. That night, Daniel stayed awake, his rifle across his knees, listening to the forest outside. The wind howled, branches creaked. But beneath those sounds, he caught faint movements, shadows slipping between trees. Quiet but not silent enough. Someone was out there, circling, searching. He whispered to himself, "They found us," and tightened his grip on the weapon. The following morning, he made a decision. They could not stay here forever. The cabin was too open, too easy to trap. He packed food, water, and a few tools, telling Lyra to wear the cloak and stay close. She looked at him with frightened eyes but obeyed without question. Together they stepped into the forest, leaving behind the small safety of their home. Daniel led her through hidden paths only hunters and wanderers knew, paths he had once used to escape trouble in his younger days. But now the trouble was larger than anything he had ever faced. As they moved, Lyra whispered in her language, finally giving him fragments of truth. She spoke of her home world, a shining place of crystal towers and gray halls. She spoke of betrayal, of soldiers turning against her family, of fire in the palace, of running away as her protectors fought and fell. Her voice cracked when she said a word Daniel could not understand, but the weight of it pressed into him like stone. He realized it must mean princess or royalty. This small child was not just an orphan. She was someone powerful, Someone dangerous to those who feared her bloodline. Daniel felt the world around him shift. It was no longer about kindness or pity. It was about survival of something greater than himself. He had taken in a child, but now he understood he was protecting a secret that could shake empires. And the hunters out there were not going to stop until they had her. Dead or captured, by nightfall, Daniel found shelter in a cave near the mountains. They lit a small fire deep inside, hidden from view. Lyra sat beside him, silent, her face glowing in the dim light, her eyes heavy with secrets. Daniel looked at her and whispered, "I don't know what you are, little one, but I won't let them take you." She reached out with her small hand, touching his arm, and though no words passed, the message was clear. She trusted him, perhaps more than anyone left in the galaxy. But outside the cave, the shadows were gathering. The hunters had followed their trail, their strange devices scanning the ground, their voices low and sharp. They moved like wolves, patient and relentless. One of them held a small beacon that pulsed red each time it pointed toward the cave. They were close, far too close. Daniel felt the air grow heavier, the silence too thick. He motioned to Lyra to stay back, his rifle ready, his heartbeat steady despite the fear in his chest. The child clutched the blanket around her shoulders, her eyes glowing faintly as her hidden power stirred again. For the first time, Daniel saw not only fear in her expression, but also strength, a strength far beyond her years. The forest outside shifted with the hunter's presence. Every step they took echoed like thunder in Daniel's ears. He knew the next hours would decide everything, whether they escaped, whether she survived, whether he could truly protect her. The shadows had begun to hunt, and the chase was only beginning. Asterisk, asterisk. Asterisk, asterisk. The cave was quiet, but the silence carried weight. Daniel sat near the fire, his rifle across his knees, while Lyra rested against the wall, her eyes half closed. For hours, he had listened to faint sounds outside, branches cracking, stones shifting, the low hum of strange devices. The hunters were still out there, circling like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. Every instinct Daniel had told him that time was running out. Lyra stirred, her silver skin glinting faintly. In the firelight, she looked at Daniel, her eyes full of something deeper than fear. It was a heavy sadness, the kind carried by those who had lost everything. Daniel met her gaze and whispered softly, "You have to tell me, little one, who are they? Why are they after you?" The girl hesitated, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders, but then she closed her eyes and spoke, her voice trembling. At first, her words were in her alien tongue, but slowly, carefully, she shaped some into broken human speech. Her voice was soft, yet each word carried weight. "Me. Lyra," she said, touching her chest. "Lyra." "Princess." Daniel blinked, staring at her in shock. He had suspected something more, but hearing it from her lips made his chest tighten. A princess, an heir to some throne beyond the stars. "Sitting in his cave, hiding like a frightened child," she continued. Her words fractured but clear enough to piece together. She spoke of her home, a great empire of shining towers and starships, a people proud and powerful. Her father had been the king, her mother the queen. She had lived in safety, surrounded by guards and teachers. Until the night of betrayal, traitors had come, soldiers loyal to greed rather than honor. The palace had burned, her family slaughtered, and only she had been carried away in a small escape pod. Her protectors had given their lives to send her far from danger, far across the stars. But the traitors had not given up. They wanted her dead because as long as she lived, she was the rightful heir. Her very existence was a threat to their stolen power. Daniel listened in silence, his hands tightening around the rifle. The fire crackled between them, but it felt like the whole universe was shifting in that small cave. He looked at the child not as a stranger anymore, but as someone who carried the weight of a kingdom. She was no ordinary orphan. She was the last hope of her people. And now she was in his care. "Why tell me now?" he asked gently. "Why trust me?" Lyra's eyes filled with tears, her small voice breaking as she answered, "Because." "You stay," she whispered. "Others run, leave, hurt. But you stay." Daniel felt something heavy stir inside him, a sense of responsibility deeper than duty. He had taken her in out of instinct, but now he realized he had been chosen. Not by fate alone, but by her trust. She had given him something more valuable than any crown, her belief that he would protect her. Outside, the night deepened, and the hunters' movements grew bolder. Daniel could hear the hum of their scanners. Closer than before, he put out the fire, letting the cave fall into shadows. "Lyra," he whispered, "if they find us, they won't stop. We'll have to fight. But I promise you, I won't let them take you." The girl nodded, her small hands glowing faintly as she pressed them together. Strange sparks danced between her fingers, forming shapes that shimmered in the dark. Daniel stared in awe, realizing that her power was not just dangerous. It was the strength of her royal bloodline, something ancient and mighty. She was not just a lost princess. She was a living weapon. And those who hunted her knew it. As dawn broke, Daniel led her from the cave, moving toward higher ground where he could see farther. The valley stretched out below, quiet but filled with threats unseen. Lyra walked beside him, her steps steadier. Now her eyes sharper. She was still a child, but something inside her was awakening, something that had been buried beneath fear. Daniel noticed it too. The way she carried herself was changing. The way her voice no longer shook when she whispered. She was beginning to remember who she was. Not just a frightened girl, but a princess in exile. They found shelter near the cliffs where Daniel built a small fire hidden under rocks. He gave her food and water. But his mind was already turning toward the future. The hunters would not give up. And more would come. If she was truly a princess, then there had to be others still loyal to her somewhere. Maybe hidden allies, maybe waiting across the stars. He had to find a way to reach them. But until then, he would be her shield, her guardian, her only family. That night, as Lyra drifted into uneasy sleep, Daniel looked at the stars above. The sky was wide and endless, filled with countless worlds. But somehow his path had narrowed to one choice: protect her or lose everything. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a purpose burning inside him, stronger than fear, stronger than loneliness. He was no longer just a wanderer. He was the protector of a princess, a secret heir, and the key to a kingdom waiting to rise again. But far away, in the darkness beyond the mountains, the hunters lit their signal. A red flare shot into the sky, marking their prey. More ships were coming. More soldiers would follow. The war for the girl had only just begun. The red flare burned in the night sky. Daniel watched it from the cliffs, his jaw tightening. It was not a signal of search anymore. It was a call to gather, a call for reinforcements. The hunters had marked their prey, and soon more would arrive. The world that had once been quiet, lonely, almost forgotten, was now a battlefield waiting to happen. He turned to Lyra, who stood beside him wrapped in the cloak, her silver eyes reflecting the fire of the flare. She looked calm, but he could see the tension in her small hands, the way her fingers twitched with hidden energy. "Listen, Lyra," he whispered, crouching to meet her gaze. "They're coming. And they won't stop, but we won't run anymore." Her eyes widened. Confusion and fear mixed together. Daniel placed his hand on her shoulder, steady and firm. "This ends tonight," he said. "We make our stand." At dawn, they moved back toward the cabin. It was dangerous to return, but Daniel knew every corner, every shadow of that place. If they had to fight, he would fight on ground he understood. Along the way, he set small traps, wires stretched between trees, pits covered with leaves, old explosives he had kept from his wandering days. He had been a soldier once, long ago, and though he had sworn never to fight again, the memory of war returned easily. His hands moved with grim skill, preparing every defense he could. Lyra followed silently, watching, learning. When they reached the cabin, she stood in the doorway, her eyes scanning the small home that had Become her shelter. Daniel gave her food, then handed her a small wooden carving. Stay inside until I call, he said, his voice steady. And no matter what happens, remember, you are not alone anymore. She clutched the carving close, nodding, though her eyes shimmered with fear. The sun had barely risen when the first hunters arrived. Dark figures moved through the trees. Their armor black and their weapons glowing faintly, they spread out. With precision, scanning the ground, their voices low and cold. Daniel lay hidden in the brush, his rifle steady, his breath controlled. When the first stepped into his trap, a sharp explosion shook the forest, throwing 2 hunters off their feet. The others scattered. Raising their weapons, Daniel fired. His shot striking true. Dropping another, the war for the cabin had begun. The hunters advanced with ruthless discipline. But Daniel fought like a man with nothing left to lose. Every trap slowed them. Every shot forced them back. Smoke and fire filled the trees, the air sharp with the smell of burning leaves. But no matter how many fell, more kept coming. They were too many, too skilled, and Daniel knew his strength alone would not be enough. Inside the cabin, Lyra heard the blasts and the shouting. She clutched the wooden carving, her heart racing. Tears filled her eyes as she listened to Daniel fighting alone. She had promised herself she would hide. But the sound of his struggle tore at her. She could not stay hidden forever. Not when he had risked everything for her. When a group of hunters broke through the defenses and rushed toward the cabin, Daniel shouted for her to stay down, but before they could enter, a flash of light burst from the doorway. Lyra stepped forward, her small body glowing with fierce energy, her silver skin bright as fire. Her eyes blazed, and with a cry that echoed across the forest, she unleashed a wave of force that sent the hunters crashing backward, their weapons torn from their hands. Daniel froze, staring. The child he had carried, the frightened girl he had sheltered, now stood like a figure of power, her true bloodline revealed in the fury of her strength. The hunters hesitated, fear flickering in their eyes. They had expected a child, weak and helpless, but what stood before them was a princess of power, a living reminder of the throne they had stolen. Daniel rose from cover, rallying beside her. Together, they fought, his rifle steady, her light blazing. The forest shook with the clash, smoke rising high as hunters fell one by one. But the battle was not without cost. Daniel took a hit across his arm, blood staining his sleeve. He gritted his teeth, refusing to fall. Lyra saw him stumble and screamed, her voice carrying a raw, ancient command that echoed in the hunters' minds. They faltered, their formation breaking. For a brief moment, silence fell. Only the sound of wind moving through the broken trees. The last of the hunters fled, retreating into the shadows. Their mission had failed. But the flare in the sky had already called more. Daniel leaned against the cabin wall, breathing hard, his body aching but his spirit unbroken. Lyra rushed to his side, her small hands glowing faintly as she tried to press against his wound. Her power did not heal, but the warmth eased his pain. He looked at her, his voice rough but firm. "You're not just a child anymore," he whispered. "You're their greatest fear, and you're my greatest reason to fight." The cabin was half burned, the forest scarred, but for the moment, they had won. Lyra stood tall beside him, her cloak torn, her eyes still glowing. For the first time, she did not look like a frightened orphan. She looked like a princess, a leader, a flame in the dark. Daniel knew the battle ahead would be harder, that stronger enemies would come. But he also knew this: he was no longer fighting alone. Together, they would face whatever came next. The forest lay in ruins after the battle. Smoke drifted through the trees, and the ground was littered with broken weapons and shattered armor. Daniel stood with his rifle hanging heavy in his hands, his arm wrapped in cloth to stop the bleeding. Beside him stood Lyra, her silver eyes glowing faintly even as her small body trembled from exhaustion. She had revealed her power, and there was no going back. The cabin was damaged, the roof half burned. The walls cracked from explosions. It was no longer safe, and Daniel knew it. But as he looked at the child beside him, he saw something new in her. Not only fear, not only sadness, but determination. She had faced the hunters, and though she was still young, she had not broken. She was rising, like a flame refusing to die. That night, they camped near the river under the open stars. Daniel tried to rest, but his mind was heavy with questions. How long could they keep running? How long before more hunters came? And more importantly, was there a way to fight back that did not mean endless fleeing? He looked at Lyra, who sat quietly by the fire, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. Finally he asked, "What do you want, Lyra? Do you want to hide forever, or do you want to stand?" She looked up, her eyes shining in the firelight. Her voice was soft, but steady. "Stand," she whispered. "Fight, no more run." Daniel nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the danger around them. She was no longer only surviving, she was choosing, and that choice carried power. The next morning, they moved toward the settlement. Daniel had always kept distant from the townsfolk, living alone on the edge of the valley, but now he knew they would need more than just themselves. When they arrived, people stared, whispering at the sight of the cloaked girl beside him. He called a meeting in the square, his voice stronger than it had been in years. Hunters had come before, raiding the outpost for supplies, and the townsfolk knew the threat of strangers. But Daniel told them more this time, not the whole truth, but enough. He spoke of enemies arriving, of danger moving through the forests. He spoke of a child they hunted, a child who needed protection. The people muttered, doubtful, fearful, until Lyra stepped forward, her hood falling back, her silver skin glowing in the sunlight. Gasps filled the square. Some recoiled in fear, others in awe, and then, when she raised her small hand and lit the torch with nothing but a spark of her power, silence fell. "This child is no enemy," Daniel said firmly. "She is a symbol, and if we protect her, we protect ourselves. Because the ones who hunt her will not stop with her. They will burn everything in their way." For a long moment, no one moved. Then an old farmer stepped forward, gripping his staff. "If what you say is true, then we cannot run either. We fight together." Others joined, some with fear in their eyes, some with courage. But slowly, the settlement began to gather around them. In the days that followed, Daniel trained them. He taught them how to build traps, how to aim weapons, how to move in the forest. The people listened, because he had been a soldier once. And his words carried weight. Lyra, too, began to change. She no longer hid in shadows but walked among them, learning their words, offering smiles. Children followed her, curious, calling her the Silver Girl. And she laughed for the first time. Laughter sounded natural, not rare. And the people began to see her not as a danger, but as hope. But Lyra was not just learning, she was teaching herself as well. Each night, she sat by the fire, practicing her powers, controlling the sparks in her hands. Daniel watched quietly, guiding her when fear made her lose control. "You don't have to be perfect," he said softly. "You just have to be ready." Her eyes shone with determination, and each night her control grew stronger. Soon, scouts returned with grim news. More hunters had landed on the far edge of the valley, larger in number, heavier armed. They were building camps, preparing for war. The people grew restless, fear spreading again. But then Lyra stepped onto the wooden platform in the square. Her cloak fell back, her silver skin glowing under the torchlight. Her voice small but steady as she spoke. "They take my home," she said, her broken human words trembling but strong. "They take my family. They take my peace, but no more. We fight, not for me alone, but for you, for all." The people cheered, their fear burning into fire. Daniel watched from the side, his heart swelling with pride. The child he had once found broken and alone was now standing as a leader, a princess rising before their eyes. That night, as the settlement prepared defenses, Daniel sat beside her by the fire. "You know, don't you," he said softly, "that this is only the beginning." Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with both sadness and strength. "Yes," she whispered, But not alone. Daniel smiled, the weight in his chest easing. For years he had wandered without purpose, but now he had one protector. Fight with her and see her rise. The hunters would come, stronger than before. The battle ahead would decide everything. But the girl who had once been only a lost child was now more. She was a princess rising, and her light was too bright for shadows to destroy. The night before the battle was heavy with silence. The settlement stood on edge, torches burning at every corner, weapons prepared, traps set across the fields. Daniel walked through the camp, checking each line, speaking quietly to the farmers, miners, and wanderers who had chosen to stand. They were not soldiers, but tonight they would fight like one, because their home, their families, and their lives depended on it. Lyra sat on a small hill near the edge of the valley, looking at the stars. Her silver eyes reflected the endless sky. Her thoughts heavy but clear. For days she had hidden, afraid of what she was. But now she stood as something different. She was no longer only a child, no longer only a survivor. She was the last spark of a kingdom, and whether she liked it or not, destiny had placed its weight on her shoulders. Daniel climbed the hill and sat beside her. His arm still bandaged, but his spirit unbroken. "You should rest," he said softly. But Lyra shook her head. "Rest later," she whispered, her voice steady. "Fight now." Daniel smiled faintly, proud of her strength but pained by her burden. She deserved laughter, childhood, freedom, not war. But fate had written a harsher path. The morning came with the sound of engines. Dark ships descended through the clouds, their shadows covering the valley like storm clouds. Hunters poured out in rows, their armor gleaming, their weapons raised. The earth trembled under their march, the air heavy with the smell of metal and fire. But on the other side of the valley, the people stood ready, led by a man who had once sworn never to fight again, and a girl who carried the blood of kings. The first clash shook the ground. Explosions tore through the trees, arrows and bullets rained down. Traps snapped shut, fire roared across the fields. Daniel fought at the front, his rifle steady, his commands sharp, his courage a shield for those who followed. The townsfolk moved with him. No longer simple farmers but defenders of their world. They stumbled, they bled, but they did not break. In the center stood Lyra, her small figure glowing brighter with every moment. She raised her hands, and energy burst from her palms, pushing enemies back, breaking their formations. Her voice rang out, not loud but commanding. She was not just fighting for herself anymore. She was leading, guiding, inspiring. Every villager who saw her stood taller, fought harder, because in her they saw not only hope but destiny. The hunters pushed forward, their numbers overwhelming. Daniel's arm burned with pain, but he refused to fall. At one point he stumbled, nearly struck down, but Lyra's light flared, shielding him, her power forming a barrier of pure energy that forced the enemies back. She cried out, her voice fierce and unyielding. "No more," she shouted. "No. Take, no kill, no more." The sound carried across the battlefield, echoing like thunder. The hunters faltered, fear spreading among them. They had expected a helpless child, but what stood before them was a princess reclaiming her crown. Even in exile, even far from her throne, she carried the strength of her people. Daniel rose again, his voice hoarse but strong. "You want her," he shouted. "You'll have to go through me, through all of us." The villagers roared in agreement, their voices shaking the valley. The battle raged until the sun stood high. When the dust finally settled, the ground was scarred, but the hunters were gone, broken and scattered. The villagers stood weary but alive, their faces streaked with sweat and ash. And in the center stood Lyra, her silver skin glowing faintly, her eyes calm. The princess had risen, and her people, though not of her blood, had chosen to stand with her. As the survivors gathered, Daniel placed his hand on Lyra's shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he said quietly. "You never will be." She looked at him, her small hand gripping his tightly. "Family," she whispered, and the word carried more weight than any crown. Daniel nodded, his eyes burning. "Yes, family," he said. And for the first time in years, he felt whole. In the days that followed, the villagers rebuilt, stronger than before. They spoke of Lyra as not just an alien child, but as their princess, their protector. Whispers spread across the stars of a girl who had survived betrayal, who had risen with the help of a human guardian. Enemies would hear these whispers, allies. 2. The war for her kingdom was not over, but it had begun anew, one night, as Daniel and Lyra stood together watching the stars. She spoke softly. "Home," she said, pointing upward. Her eyes filled with both longing and determination. Daniel looked at her, then at the endless sky. "Then we'll find it," he said, his voice steady. "We'll take it back." She nodded, her smile small but fierce. Her journey was far from finished, but her destiny was no longer hidden. She was a princess, a leader, a beacon, and with Daniel at her side, she would rise again. The story of the lost child had ended. The story of the princess had just begun.